Geniuses and talented learners, restriction and freedom. One of the most intriguing things about Blue Lock lately has been figuring out where each player and character falls under these four categories. In fact, this subject specifically has been eating up my brain ever since it was introduced in the PXG game. To me, this has to be one of the best aspects to this show, just the writer giving us the ability to actually figure out how each character thinks, what motivates each player and how they ultimately achieve their goals. And for someone like me who loves to put players against one another, this in all honesty is just a gold mine. And so what we are going to do in today's video is actually go over every player that matters in Blue Lock and figure out where they fall, whether they are geniuses or talented learners, but more importantly, whether they are restriction versus freedom. And I say this because figuring out if a player is a genius or a talented learner is rather easy. Sure, there are some sketchy players, but overall we can figure out this very easy. Figuring out whether a player is restriction or freedom is rather tricky, especially because we are at such a high level that most restriction players actually do well even in freedom. Case in point, Kaiser prior to the PXG game. But trust me guys, figuring out this is very crucial for us to understand Blue Lock better, and it is also very crucial for me so I can give you the best matchups you've seen on YouTube. But without any further ado, let's jump right into the video. And let's start with our first player, which will be Agi. Now for it to be easier to categorize, I am going to go about it alphabetically, and so Agi is the first player we are going to start with. And what's funny, it immediately gets tricky. The first player on the list is straight up one of the trickiest. Not only because it is hard to figure out whether he is restriction or freedom, but also it is tricky to tell if he is a genius or a talented learner. You see, Agi's weapon is his insane jumps in the air and the insane stunts he do while floating. And this initially signals that he is a genius, much like the likes of Aryu or Kunigami. However, I don't think that's the case, and I feel like by figuring out another player who is like him, it gets pretty easy. In fact, the other player is the one right after him. I am of course talking about Oliver Aiku. You see, while Aiku is a great high flyer, and he is one of the strongest players on the ground, he is definitely a talented learner, and for two reasons. First, metavision. I feel like metavision is the easiest indicator that a player is a talented learner. There is one exception which we will get to with Rin later in the video, but this is a rule of thumb. If a player possesses metavision, he is almost certainly a talented learner. But the second reason is the way Aiku views the world. The way Aiku thinks is that of a talented learner. Instead of impulsively knowing what to do, Aiku actually needs to observe, analyze, and then adapt to whatever situation he finds himself in. And in this regard specifically, I feel like Agi is the same as him. He might not have the analytical power of Aiku or the intelligence of the likes of Snuffy or Isagi. However, without a doubt, Aiku's way of thinking is that of a talented learner. He is always the type of a player who observes, analyzes, and then tries to counter. We've seen him in the NAL do it with Kaiser, Nagi, and Reo. And so for that reason, I think Agi is definitely a talented learner. However, it doesn't end with this. Just figuring out if he is a talented learner is not enough. You see, because there are extreme talented learners who are absolutely nothing without their way of thinking and their way of analyzing. However, there are other talented learners who also have a lot of latent talent, and each player relies on that talent differently. In the same boat, there are extreme geniuses, or as I like to call them, pure geniuses, the likes of Shido or Bachira. However, there are other geniuses like Barou or Noa who actually have a mentality that is kinda similar to talented learners. And so most players are actually not extremes. Most players are actually on a spectrum. And in fact, this also extends to being a freedom type versus restriction type. And obviously there will be a borderline between the categories. However, some players will be closer to the other category than others. As for Agi, I think me saying that he excels at jumping should tell you everything about where he stands in comparison to the other talented learners, as I will place him here in tier 3, with tier 1 being pure talented learners, tier 2 being players who have latent talent but they fall a lot on their way of thinking more than they do on their talent. Tier 3 is kind of a mix. The player obviously thinks like a talented learner, but he has a lot of traits from geniuses. And finally, tier 4, we have players that sometimes even act like geniuses. And of course, it goes without saying that this is mirrored when it comes to geniuses, with them also having 4 tiers. But now that we actually figure out that Agi is a talented learner, where does he actually stand on the spectrum? You see, because he is an extreme high flyer, I think Agi sits comfortably in tier 3. But let's actually move on to figuring out whether he is freedom versus restriction. I feel like it is quite easy. Agi is definitely a freedom type. He excels in an environment where creativity is actually fostered. And in fact, I'll take it a step further and say this. Agi is such a freedom type player that he forces his own creativity on other players, which in the case of Nagi and Reo did not work. Not because they are restriction against his freedom, but it is because him and Prince tries to force their creativity onto the other players. And actually, this is a very important point. You see, because Agi required his freedom to be applied to either Nagi or Reo, I think he is not an absolute freedom type player. He is definitely freedom, of course, however he is not on the end of the spectrum, and I say he sits perfectly in the middle. However, with this we are done with Agi, and let's move on to the second player, which I've already spoken of a little bit. Of course, I'm talking about Oliver motherfrickin' Aiku. Now, as I said, Aiku is definitely a talented learner. The way he analyzes the strikers and then adapts to them definitely makes him a talented learner, in addition to, of course, him having meta vision. However, hold on, sure he is a talented learner, but what tier is he? Well, in fact, the same as Agi, seeing that they both also rely a lot on their talent. They do not act like geniuses at all, but they do rely a lot on their physical talent. And so, much like Agi, Aiku is definitely tier 3 as well. However, what do you guys think? Is he restriction or freedom type player? Well, it's actually pretty obvious. If we just look at the way he plays, Aiku always excels and always enters a new gear whenever he is in a pinch. Whenever he is under restraints, Aiku actually shines. And in fact, the way he actually handled Isagi in the Uber's games all but confirms that he is restriction. He needed to completely neutralize Isagi's freedom in order to have the edge over him. However, when things were free for Isagi, either at the start or when Hiori joined, Aiku's performance actually suffered a little bit against Isagi. And in the last game, we've seen him as Onazi was entering new gears. Aiku was also rising to the challenge, and so he is definitely restriction. However, I wouldn't say he is an extreme form of restriction, just because I feel like there are other players, and 3 specifically I should say, that excel so much in restriction, they define what it means to be purely restrictive. And so for that reason, I think Aiku will be sitting in the middle of being restrictive. But next, let's move on to one of my favorite characters in the show, which is Aryu, who I always call the dark horse of Blue Lock. He's always lingering and he is always doing great, without the writer actually needing to focus on his journey a lot. However, where does Aryu actually stand? Is he like Aiku and Agi, seeing that he jumps high as well? Well, as I alluded to at first, Aryu is definitely a genius. He is not the type to analyze, adapt or anything. He impulsively knows what to do at any given point, and he impulsively knows what to do with his insane reach and his absurdly broken jumping ability, which actually might be the best in the U20 category as of yet. However, I wouldn't say that Aryu is actually an extreme genius. You see, him actually trying to always shine makes me believe that he cares a little bit too much about what other players think about him, and so for that reason I think Aryu sits comfortably at tier 3 of being a genius. However, is he freedom or is he restriction? Well, to be honest, I feel like Aryu is one of the most obvious players on the list. He is definitely extreme freedom type player. He excels in environments where he can do whatever he likes with his high jumping ability and his insane reach. But next we have everyone's favorite monster, Bachira Meguru. And I feel like Bachira is straight to the point. He is not just a genius, he is a pure genius. In fact, he is one of only 5 players who are completely pure geniuses. As for him being freedom or restriction, I feel like it is pretty obvious. Bachira is definitely freedom type. Much like Aryu, he is an extreme freedom type player. And most of the times, whenever restriction is placed on him, his performance usually suffers. However, moving on to my all-time favorite player, Barou. Now, obviously, Barou is a genius. I feel like, much like Bachira, he is one of the obvious ones. He is a genius without a doubt. However, due to his way of thinking and due to how he sees the world, I feel like Barou is as close as it gets to being a talented learner, taking the first spot in tier 4 of being a genius. And honestly, I feel like this is a no-brainer. As you all know, he does a lot of things impulsively. But in a lot of instances, for example, like what happened in the U20 game in his goal, he also analyzed what Isagi and Rin were doing and he matched them, completely cementing that he has a lot of traits from talented learners. And I think this is a good time where I should explain this. You see, to me, talented learners are defined by two criteria. The first is the way they view the world. If their goals are things that are recognizable by the world, then the player is most likely to be a talented learner. If a player is only self-centered and cares only about what he can achieve that is satisfactory to him, the player leans towards being a genius. However, that's not all. Talented learners excel in one thing, which is witnessing, analyzing, and then adapting, while geniuses excel in being irregular and randomly mutate throughout the game. However, what happens if a player has an overlap between the two categories we use to figure out which is which? And in fact, Barou is the perfect example. He is definitely a genius, without a doubt. Not only him wanting to be the king of football is something that is only recognizable to him, but also he mutates a lot like he did in the second selection. But here and there, Barou also excels at analyzing and then adapting, bringing him very close to being a talented learner. And so, for that reason, I am placing him in tier 4. However, where does he stand in terms of freedom versus restriction? Well, to be honest, there is a statement from Reo that kinda makes it seem as if Barou is definitely a freedom type player. You see, in the Nagi spin-off novel, when Team V faced Team X, that Barou only shines when he is not pushed. If a physically gifted player like Zantetsu or Kunigami try to challenge him, in addition to other players, Barou's playing style doesn't perform as well. And so, he must be freedom type, right? Well, no. You see, all of this, everything that Reo saw, was actually before Barou awakened. And as you all know from Rin, Isagi and Kaiser, we only know the nature of the player once he awakens. And the way Barou awakened, the way Barou scored his goals in the NEL and in the U20 game, he is definitely restriction type. Obviously not the purest form of restriction, but he is also very deep in that. And so I am going to place him in the middle. But next, let's move to the first pro on the list, which is Adam Blake. You see, the way he plays, he is definitely a genius. Whether he is the purest form or not, we actually cannot tell. We've seen him only for a few moments, and it's not really enough for us to actually dictate where he stands. I would not place him as the purest form, but I will comfortably give him the second tier. However, what's tricky is figuring out whether he is restriction or freedom. I mean, in the two games we've seen him, he kinda shines in both. And so I feel like we need a little bit more information for us to figure out where he stands. However, for the sake of this video, I am actually going to compare him to another player that will come later on the list, who actually leans towards being a genius but also restriction type. Not the purest form of restriction, but he is in the middle. And so that's where I am going to put Blake. However, next, let's talk about the first New Gen 11 on the list, which is Bunny Iglesias. Now, just from the way things went between him and Sae, it is actually pretty obvious that Sae hit the wall of evolution against Bunny, making Bunny an easy choice to be a genius. I would not put him as pure yet because we don't know, and so he will sit comfortably in the second tier. As for him being restriction versus freedom, we actually do not know, which for the fact that he plays well with Lavinho, I think he is a freedom type player. And in fact, I am actually going to put him on the extreme of being freedom type, simply because of his perfect interaction with Levi. However, next, let's talk about another pro, which is Kavasos. You see, the latter actually has metavision, and so it is a no-brainer that he is a talented learner. However, where does he actually stand? Now, at first, I was going to put him as a pure talented learner. However, I feel like we do not know much for me to make that bold statement, and so he will sit comfortably in tier 2. As for being freedom or restriction, I actually have no idea. I am leaning towards him being restriction, and that's why I am going to put him like the weakest form of restriction, but just know that I really do not know that well. However, after Kavasos, we have Charles Cavalier, which by simply having metavision you can already tell that he is a talented learner. But it gets tricky with Charles. You see, he definitely analyzes the field before he adapts and then counters. However, at the same time, he sometimes acts a lot impulsively. And so I am going to place him maybe at tier 4 or tier 3. I am leaning towards tier 3 because tier 4 only have 3 players and they are all crazy close to being geniuses. And for that reason, I am going to put him on the same tier as Agi. Now, for him being restriction versus freedom, I feel like just watching the PXG game would tell you that he is definitely freedom type. He excels in loose environments where he can deliver amazing passes to his strikers, and the moment any restriction is put on him, we see him give up on the game entirely, and that's definitely a freedom type player for sure. However, next we have everyone's favorite princess, Chigiri Hyoma. Now obviously Chigiri is a genius. I mean, he relies on nothing but his speed, and he thinks so highly of his speed that it is obvious that he is a genius. As for whether he is restriction versus freedom, well, it actually doesn't matter. He has no future. I'm just kidding. I feel like his performance at the end of the Bayern Munich game should tell you everything about where he stands. You see, at first, due to his speed, he was completely dominating. However, whenever he is put under pressure, he does not behave as good as he would do in cleared situations. And so, he is definitely freedom type. I would not put him on Bachira, Bunny or Aryu's level, where they are total freedom freaks. And so, he will be sitting in the middle. And in fact, the other 2 speedsters on the list will be sitting right next to him. Maybe not straight next to him, but close enough. However, next we actually have a non-player, which is Ego Jinpachi. Where does the orchestrator of Blue Lock actually stand? Now straight up I gotta say this, if you think Ego is anything but a talented learner and the purest form of a talented learner, then you've been reading Red Key and not Blue Lock. Ego is one of the easy ones to identify. He is definitely a talented learner from the way he thinks, acts, and talks to the Blue Lockers. However, what about freedom versus restriction? I know what you might think, he is definitely freedom. I mean, he runs a big program that requires him to be open-ended, and so he should be freedom. Well, not quite. The environment is hellish, and it feels as if Ego understands that restriction is actually key. And so, is he actually restriction? Well, I'm actually confused to be honest. In the live stream, we settled on him being a total freedom type player. However, the more I think about the hellish environment, the more I am leaning towards him being restriction. But I gotta say this as a final thought. I doubt a restriction type player would actually have the patience for any of this. And so I think Ego is a freedom type. And the fact that he deals with all of these players, I think he is on the extreme of being a freedom type player. Meaning Ego actually mirrors Bachira. He is a talented learner and the purest form at that, but also he is a freedom type and the purest form at that. Next, we have the first goalkeeper on our list, Fukaku-Gen. And I gotta say, he remains the player that we know actually nothing about. He is actually featless, and so it is simply impossible for me to place him as a talented learner or a genius. And in fact, this also goes for him being freedom versus restriction. We actually do not know anything about him. And honestly, the only reason he actually survived is because the writer understands that we need 2 goalkeepers for the World Cups. That's the only reason Fukaku survived the Neo Egoist League. Other than that, however, he really does not matter, and so let's just put him in the middle and forget about him. However, the next player after him is actually the second and the only goalkeeper that matters in Blue Lock. Of course, I'm talking about Gagamaru, and honestly, Gagamaru is one of the easiest to identify players, at least in terms of being a genius or a talented learner, because as you all know, he completely relies on his instincts and reflexes in order to perform his insane stunts, and so he is definitely a genius without a doubt. In fact, he is one of the most pure geniuses in Blue Lock. However, it is actually rather tricky to figure out whether he is freedom or restriction type. You see, at first, when we look at his performance, Gagamaru seems to be the type of player who survives in any environment, making him a definite freedom type player. However, a deeper look would reveal something else. You see, whenever the player has a lot of options, Gagamaru typically fails in stopping his shots. However, when things are really dicey, and when the striker either has fewer options or when he forces his way through, Gagamaru actually shines a lot in this environment. making him without a doubt a restriction type player. That's why his special training was one where he has no time at all, meaning he is put in the ultimate restriction. But next we have Hiraji, the guy who Nagi faced in the second selection. And honestly at first I thought he is definitely a genius. The way he traps the ball and shoots is too similar to Nagi. However, much like we explained with Aiku, that's not always the case. Just having insane talent does not mean you are necessarily a genius. In fact, the way Hiraji thinks is definitely that of a talented learner. However, because he has an insane talent that is carrying him most of the times, I think he should be the first talented learner in tier 4. He is very close to geniuses with the way he uses his talent. However, his way of thinking is definitely that of a talented learner. As for where he stands in terms of freedom or restriction, the guy is definitely freedom type. I mean, the moment Nagi applied a lot of restriction on him, we were shown how fragile his playing style, and so he is definitely freedom type. However, I don't think he is an extreme form of freedom. I think he is below the middle here. And so that's where we are going to place him. But next we have the second new Gen 11 on our list, which is actually the newest of them all, Hugo. Now from the little information we have on him, I am leaning towards him being a talented learner. He is actually seeming to be like Isagi and Sae, a very analytical talented learner, and so that's where I am going to put him. However, because I don't want to take any risks with him, I'm not going to say he is a pure talented learner, and I am going to put him in tier 2 next to Kavasos. As where he stands in terms of freedom versus restriction, I think he is definitely freedom type. And I really can't explain it that well until we actually talk about Isagi, who is actually right after Hugo. And so let's bring him into the conversation and figure out why Hugo is actually freedom type. Well, first, obviously, as you all know, Isagi is a talented learner. He said it about himself, Ego said it about him, and it is pretty obvious. However, I wouldn't say he is a pure talented learner, because unlike what you might believe, he has an insane talent that he actually relies on it often, which is his copying ability. Most of the times, non-special players find it hard to copy other players. However, Isagi is capable of doing it almost effortlessly. Of course, he's not copying insane moves or anything, but honestly, it's not like the moves he copies are easy as well. And so, for that reason, I will be placing him in tier 2 of being a talented learner, right next to Hugo and Kavasos. However, and speaking of Hugo, where does Isagi stand in terms of freedom versus restriction? And I mean, he said it about himself as well, he is definitely freedom type. And I am willing to bet that he is the extreme form of freedom type. He is much like Bachira. He requires total freedom for him to shine. And in any situation where restriction is put on him, his performance really suffers. Think about the Uber's game. He got completely killed off by Aiku once the latter unlocked his metavision. By putting enough restriction on Isagi, the latter could not do anything. However, the moment Hiori joined the game and he gave Isagi the freedom that he needs, he was able to shine once more. And I feel like his interaction with Rin at the end of the PXG game is the biggest testament to that. You see, when Rin put his ultimate restriction on Isagi, the latter could not do anything, he could not even breathe. And the only reason he was able to score is because Ness actually gave him a lot of freedom. Ness actually gave the ultimate pass, and the whole situation required the player to have insane freedom in order to capitalize. And what I am talking about here is the fact that everyone thought of Ness as being useless in this game. He could not break through. However, Isagi kept his options open and he was able to capitalize, cementing that he is in fact a pure freedom type player. However, how does he actually connect to Hugo? You see, I feel like it is due to their playing style. Hugo seems to be the same as Isagi, albeit maybe not a striker. He seems to rely a lot on adaptability, the same as Isagi. And I feel like in order to have an extreme adaptability, one must be freedom type. One must keep his options open in order to adapt to everything. Restriction type players usually force their way through, rather than adapting to others. However, due to that statement from Hugo, I am going to place him the same as Isagi. And I feel like he is going to be Isagi's rival rival in the U20 World Cups. However, I gotta say, that rivalry point I just spoke of actually is the perfect transition into the next player. You see, I don't know if this is a coincidence, but it seems that Isagi's ultimate rivals are next to him in terms of naming. Hugo is right before him, and Michael Kaiser is right behind him. As I said, this seems to be a coincidence, but I don't know, you never know with a genius of a writer like this one. However, this means that the next player we're gonna talk about is none other than Michael Kaiser, who I think needs no explanation. He is a talented learner and he is restriction type. Now, the only thing interesting about Kaiser is actually figuring out what tier he stands in terms of being a talented learner. Because we know he is an extreme form of restriction, that's the only point that matters. Now, I am going to place him in tier 3, meaning he is very close to geniuses. However, he is not the same as Hiraji. Sure, the Kaiser impact was born out of his special muscles, but much like Isagi said, it was his brain that actually conjured that weapon, and so I feel like Kaiser would sit perfectly in tier 3, which means we gotta move to the next player, which is none other than Karasu Tabito. Now obviously, because he unlocked Metavision, I think Karasu is definitely a talented learner. Whether he is a pure talented learner or not, I am actually kinda confused. You see, back in the third selection, Karasu seemed to be a player with an insane talent, and so even though he is a talented learner, he should be closer to being a genius. However, everything changed about Karasu when we learned a little bit about him. You see, even his insane talent and his insane dueling ability are born from the way he thinks. It's not like Isagi where he subconsciously conjured the double gun volley. Karasu completely relies on reading the field and employing weapons that would fit in that situation. And so I think he is definitely a pure talented learner. As for being restriction versus freedom, I think Karasu is going to be the first neutral player on our list. We've seen him excel in freedom when he was keeping up with Kaiser, but at the same time he did wonders when things got restrictive. I would say that maybe he leans towards being restriction, but I don't know, I feel like him being at the middle fits perfectly. And actually, even when I did the live stream, the chat was split between calling him freedom type or restriction type. But next we have everyone's favorite fodder, Kiyora Ryuse. I think he is definitely a talented learner. You see, he seems to care a lot about what the world think about him. When he was eliminated from Blue Lock, the first thing that came to his mind is actually the fact that he is Japan's jewel and yet he has been eliminated. And so from this, I think he is definitely a talented learner. I don't know if he is a pure talented learner or have genius tendencies, and so for that reason I am going to put him next to Kavasos as a tier 2 player. For restriction versus freedom, however, I think he is definitely a freedom type player. Maybe not an extreme form of freedom like Isagi or Bachira, but he is definitely freedom type, simply because he was doing great until restriction was put on him by Bachira and Isagi in the tag game. That way his whole world crumbled at his feet, and so he is definitely freedom type. But next after him we have none other than the guy standing in the borderline, Kiyora. Now, with Kiyora, it's actually easier to identify if he is freedom versus restriction, simply because being on the borderline means that you are waiting for restriction, meaning Kiyora is definitely restriction type. I don't know if I should say he is an extreme form of restriction like Gagamaru, but he is definitely restriction. As for being a genius or a talented learner, I think he leans towards being a genius. I think the way he thinks is not that of a talented learner. He is not the player to actually analyze and then adapt. He simply stands on the borderline and does whatever comes to his mind, much like it was the case with his assist to Kaiser. The guy simply knew what must be done, and he knew that he actually had to choose Kaiser, and so for that reason I am going to put him as a genius. However, I'm not so sure if he would fit as him being a pure genius, or hell, even being tier 2, and so for that reason I am putting him in tier 3. However, next we have everyone's favorite hero, Kunigami Rensuke. Now, to be honest, Kunigami is the same as Kaiser. Isagi explained his playing style thoroughly. He is restriction type and he is a genius, and so that's where he is going to stand. But of course, having said that, the only thing intriguing left about Kunigami is actually figuring out what tier he is standing. And for that, I gotta say I think he fits perfectly in tier 3. Sure, he is a very oppressive genius, but we always see him train his physicality, meaning he is very aware of what he needs to do in order to foster his talent. And so I think tier 3 fits perfectly with him. But next we move from Kunigami to Isagi's right hand man, Kurona Ranze. Now, obviously Kurona is a genius. He relies a lot on his speed and his ability to react to whatever Isagi is doing. He does not bother himself with reading the field, nor actually is he trying to understand it. He just runs impulsively to wherever he thinks is best, and so for that reason he is definitely a genius. And seeing that he relies a lot on his speed and instincts, I am going to put him in tier 2. He is not like Gagamaru or Bachira, who are completely absorbed in their own talent. He relies on Isagi to read the field, and then Kurona simply reacts. And for that reason, I feel like Kurona would sit perfectly in tier 3. As for being restriction versus freedom, the fact that he needs Isagi and he needs the latter to tell him what to do, I feel like it is pretty self-explanatory. He is a restriction type. And I feel like him standing next to Kiyora in this aspect specifically is just perfect, and so that's where Kurona is going to stay. However, moving on to the brains of the Nigerian team, Kuso. Now, from the way things looked, I would say that Kuso is definitely a talented learner. He is actually more analyzing of Onazi's talent than anything, and so he is definitely a talented learner. I would not say he is pure, and I would comfortably put him in tier 2. As for being restriction versus freedom, I think he is definitely freedom type. The fact that he could not react to Blue Lock when they applied the restriction should tell you everything. The guy is definitely a freedom type. But let's move on to actually another pro, and I feel like he is the easiest pro to identify because he is simply Bachira when he grows up. Of course, I'm talking about Levi the dancer, and because I just said that, he is definitely the purest form of genius and the purest form of freedom, standing right besides Bachira. But moving from one extreme pro to another. Next, we actually have Julian Loki, the guy who would actually destroy Japan in the next game. In any case, however, as for where Loki stands, I think it is pretty obvious. Much like Levi, he is definitely the purest form of genius, and so he is in tier 1. As for restriction versus freedom, I think he is the same as Chigiri. Speedsters that rely on themselves, unlike Kurona or Otoya for example, tend to do well in free environments. And that's simply a fact of life. Speedsters need a lot of space in order to run, and so Loki is definitely freedom. I wouldn't say he is on the extreme side of freedom, but I would say that he is definitely above the middle point, being an amazing freedom type, but not an extreme one at that. But next, let's actually talk about everyone's favorite zombie, Don Lorenzo. Now, for being a talented learner versus a genius, it's actually kinda tricky despite it seeming to be very easy. You see, at first, Isagi suspected that Lorenzo might have metavision, and that's because the latter just pulled one of the best perception feats in the entirety of the NEL, stopping Kaiser without actually sticking to him. However, after the game progressed, it became very clear that Lorenzo is definitely a genius. Where he stands, however, on the spectrum, that's a different story. I feel like Lorenzo is so close into being a pure genius. However, I think he is not the same as Gagamaru, Loki, or Bachira. Sure, Lorenzo is reliant on his insane talent, especially with perception and agility. However, I feel like because he follows Snuffy that much, I am going to bring him a tier closer to being a talented learner. And so Lorenzo is sitting comfortably in tier 2. As for being restriction versus freedom, I think it is pretty obvious. He loves to put restriction on the strikers of the other team, and if that's not enough, he actually follows Snuffy's plans to a T, which of course made him shine in the process. However, for our sake, he is definitely restriction type. But moving on to another pro, and now we have Levi's ultimate rival, Leonardo Luna. Now, to be honest, at first I thought Luna is definitely a talented learner. The way he was talking to Rin kinda made it seem as if he's a talented learner. However, the Nagi spin-off novel turned everything upside down, and now I am 100% sure that he is a genius. Not only because of his insane talent and dribbling abilities, but also due to the way he thinks. When Nagi asked him why he fights, instead of doing what talented learners do and explain their thought process, in a very genius fashion, Luna actually gave a very vague answer. He said that, "Can you actually ask why birds fly?" And so to me, this automatically puts him as a genius. However, because he leans a lot towards being a talented learner, because he has a lot of their traits, I am going to put him in tier 4. Now for the following parts guys, you have to excuse my voice. As you all know, I've been sick for a few days, and even when I recovered, my voice was completely broken for 3 days. And so when I woke up today feeling a little bit better, I decided to record immediately so I can get the video out as soon as possible. And so please don't mind my voice and continue to enjoy this video, as the next player we have on the list is actually the one who inspired the whole idea, Nagi Seishiro. You see, I wanted to put full potential Nagi against full potential Rin, the ultimate two geniuses of Blue Lock against one another with their full potential unlocked. However, I struggled a little bit with figuring out where Nagi stands. I mean, it is easy enough to say that he is a genius, that's just a given. However, is he freedom or is he restriction? This small question really made my gears grind. I really tried to pinpoint where does Nagi stand, and even when I figured that out, in my Nagi vs Rin video, a lot of you guys seem to disagree of how I actually categorized Nagi, and so I definitely needed to do this video. But before we actually jump to this point specifically, let's figure out where does Nagi stand in terms of geniuses. Is he a complete pure genius, or is he close to being a talented learner? I honestly believe that Nagi has been one of the purest geniuses we've seen in the show. No one has been giving up to nothing but his own talent as much as Nagi. Even Bachira and Shido failed to compare to Nagi. But I feel like due to his laziness, he relied a lot on the likes of Isagi and Reo, which kinda hurts his pure genius status, and so I am going to place him in tier 2. Mind you, this is for current Nagi. I feel like in the future, Nagi will not care about the team, and he will play simply like Bachira. Whenever a play is exciting to his instincts, Nagi will simply go with it, whether be it scoring for himself or even passing. Point is, right now I am going to place him in tier 2, however I am sure he is as pure as Bachira when he gets his full ego back. However, none of this really matters. I feel like this is an easy pick. Let's actually talk about the more interesting stuff. Let's talk about where Nagi stands in terms of freedom versus restriction. Now, in my Rin vs Nagi video, a lot of you guys said that Nagi is definitely restriction. And honestly, I totally understand where you are coming from. Nagi definitely seems to be restriction at first. I mean, for instance, in the NEL, he did not succeed in a system that gave him complete creative control. I mean, sure, Nagi was doing amazing stuff, but it did not lead him to score. However, I want you actually guys to think about another player regarding this, which is Michael Kaiser. Do you think it was the same case? Do you think the Kaiser system is the same as Agi and Prince working with Nagi? Or hell, do you think the relationship between Nagi and Reo is the same as Ness and Kaiser before? Well, actually no. You see, the Kaiser system follows Kaiser's ideal. They follow Kaiser's ideas and creativity in order to reach the goal. However, the system put in by Agi and Prince was completely different. They were forcing their own freedom onto Nagi. They were forcing their ideal playing style into Nagi. And that's something Ness actually never did. Ness always followed Kaiser. He always gave him passes that fit with whatever Kaiser was trying to achieve. Reo, Agi and Prince on the other hand, they were the ones trying to lead Nagi. They are the ones who gave him passes that they thought are ideal for Nagi's playing style, which by definition makes this a form of restriction. Them forcing their creativity onto Nagi is definitely a form of restriction, whether be it Reo, Agi or Prince. On the flip coin, think about the relationship between Levi and Bachira and Otoya. You see, Levi actually never instructed them on what they should do. He never told them to go for the ball in a certain way. Of course, he gave them techniques, but they were meant to elevate their own creativity. The Jenga technique that Bachira took needs the player to be super creative in the first place in order to utilize it. Meaning, Levi was only enhancing Bachira's creativity. He never told him to do it like this, and he never told him to control his monster like this. Instead, he simply told him to take it to the next step with whatever Bachira is thinking, and that definitely worked wonders for someone like Bachira, who is the extreme form of freedom. Speaking of Bachira actually, whenever I look at Nagi and the shit he pulls in the air, I always think that he is a dribbler like Bachira, but he always does his thing in the air, and I feel like that by definition makes him freedom type. However, I can drive the point further. You see, we never saw Nagi's true level until he got rid of Reo. Until he got rid of Reo's chains that Nagi was able to embrace his genius. Because as we've seen in their first challenge against Barou, Nagi simply said to Isagi to just give him the ball and he would actually take care of things, and that he actually did. And in fact, we've seen this even prior to that. When Reo's freedom was completely restricted by Raichi, it was Nagi that embraced his own freedom. It was Nagi that took the creative leading role, telling both Reo and Zantetsu that they need to deliver passes to him that fit with his own ideas. And that definitely makes Nagi a freedom type. However, there is actually another point. If one's freedom imposed on another freedom type becomes restriction, how does Isagi work perfectly with the likes of Hiori and Bachira, where we actually know that both are freedom type players? Well, Isagi actually never imposed his ideas onto others, with the exception with Kurona. You see, in the Uber's game, Isagi did not tell Hiori what to do. He let the latter reach that conclusion by himself. And then in the PXG game, we've seen that Isagi had no issue with Hiori giving the ball to Kaiser. He did not care as long as Hiori was true to himself. And that's actually the same for Bachira. Bachira only goes for plays that ignite his soul, meaning that in order for him to pass to anyone, the latter needs to pull off an insane stunt like Otoya did, or actually match Bachira perfectly. And that's what Isagi was doing. He never tried to tell Bachira how to play his game, and he never tried to restrict him. He only showed him the insane flame that could happen when Bachira plays with Isagi. And I gotta say it here, I'm talking about Bachira after awakening. Before, I feel like he was the same as Nagi. Bachira failed because he was following Isagi and Ren. The same as Nagi in the NEL. He was following Agi, Prince and Reo, and never really stayed true to himself until he was kicked out of Blue Lock. And so for that reason, I think Nagi is definitely a freedom type. And in fact, I think he is one of the highest freedom types in the show. And honestly, in the future, I see him being the same as Bachira. One does his shenanigans on the ground and the latter destroys everyone in the air. However, and while talking about Isagi and Hiori, I noticed something. I did not actually cover Hiori when I reached the letter H. And honestly, I am a little bit ashamed of myself. How could I actually forget about Hiori, one of the most crucial players to today's video? Because I honestly feel like he defines perfectly his category, which is talented learners that are very close to being geniuses. You see, in reality, it was Hiori and Prince that made me realize that most players fit on a spectrum, and they do not fall on the extremes. However, the case for Hiori is really interesting. You see, the guy has a perfect body for Blue Lock. If we didn't know any better, we would say that he is definitely a genius. He has perfect genetics for sports, he has insane technicality for football, and even his demeanor and sometimes his actions relay that he is a genius. However, before we move on with this, I gotta say that Hiori is one of the most obvious players when it comes to restriction versus freedom. Hiori is definitely a freedom type, and it's not even a debate. In fact, I think he is on the extreme of being a freedom type. In any case, however, going back to him being actually very close to geniuses, as I was saying, beyond his perfect body and technicality, even the way he conveys himself on the field sometimes feels like he is a genius. You see, Hiori always goes for the most optimal spot on the pitch, and most of the times the way he selects that spot is entirely impulsive. Even though he has metavision, he tends to completely ignore the players and go for the optimal spot regardless of what the strikers could do, and this honestly makes him very close to being a genius. However, I am sure he is a talented learner, not because Isagi told us and not because he has metavision, even though those are dead giveaways. The main reason is actually his thought process. You see, in order to stop Charles, Hiori had to analyze, adapt, and then overcome him, signaling that he is definitely a talented learner. And so I am going to place Hiori next to Hiraji as the closest to being geniuses, while of course him being freedom type. However, next we have Nanase, which is honestly a player I really do not care about in the slightest. And so I am going to keep it short and sweet. Nanase is neither a genius nor a talented learner. He is an average Joe. Maybe he leans a little bit towards being a genius, but I am keeping him in the middle. As for restriction versus freedom, he was actually doing great when Rin gave him the freedom. However, the moment Rin fell under insane restriction, Nanase completely faded out, and so he is definitely freedom. But next we have the magician Alexis Ness. Now we all know that Ness is definitely a genius. I mean, in order to improve, he did not analyze or adapt. He just mutated from a state that was lacking behind into one that surpassed Hiori and Charles and was on Kaiser and Isagi's level, and so he is without a doubt a genius. However, I feel like due to him relying a lot on Kaiser, I'm not going to place him as a pure genius and not even in the second tier. I am actually going to put him in the third tier next to the likes of Aryu. As for where he stands in terms of freedom versus restriction, I feel like it is a little bit tricky with Ness. At first, you might think that he is definitely restriction, because after he was pushed by Kaiser and Isagi, he actually evolved and reached a new height. But that actually could not be farthest from the truth. Ness did not awaken because he was pushed. He awakened because he was ignored by everyone, meaning he awakened in the ultimate freedom state. And for that reason, I am going to place him as the highest form of freedom. However, moving on to the next player, which is none other than Nico Ikki. Now, in all honesty, I feel like Nico is one of the purest talented learners in the show. He lacks any insane talent whatsoever except his high perception, his eyes, and his brain. And so, much like Ego and Karasu, he is one of the purest talented learners in the show. As for being restriction versus freedom, I feel like it is a little bit obvious as well. Nico excels in teams with laid out plans. That's what differentiates him from Isagi. While Isagi is malleable and adapts at every turn, Nico prefers rigid systems that lead into goals. That's why he excelled under Snuffy and he excelled when he followed Barou, meaning that Nico is definitely restriction. I would not say he is on the extreme of being restriction, but I would put him on the same level as Aiku, which is kinda ironic. But moving on to my second favorite character in the show, Noel Noa. I feel like Noa being a genius is just a must. We know this from Isagi's statement, and we know this because Noa does everything impulsively. However, there is a catch. Sure, he is a genius, but I feel like he is in the tier that is the closest to talented learners, and that's all due to his rationality. Even though he is a genius, and even though he is impulsively strong, Noa still has one of the smartest brains in the game, and he has what's probably the highest perception if we exclude metavision, and of course we can't forget about his rational way of thinking. And so I feel like he is the same as Barou. In fact, even in terms of restriction versus freedom, I feel like he is the same as Barou as well. And for those who are asking, here's the simple argument. In order to become stronger, Noa needs strong opponents to put a leash on him. He needs restriction in order to evolve, making him 100% restriction type. However, I gotta say this, I'm not going to put him as an extreme form of restriction because Noa is that oppressive and because it is really tough to push him that hard, meaning I feel like he does not reach that extreme level of restriction. However, that's all for Noa, and let's move to the dark horse of the Japan versus Nigeria game, which is the Nigerian defender Obo. Now, Obo is definitely a genius. He does not analyze the field and he does not adapt. He impulsively fights the strikers and thus he is definitely a genius. Whether he is restriction versus freedom, well, I feel like it is a little bit obvious as well. He was not doing great at the beginning of the game when things was completely free. However, once the blue lockers pushed them, him and Onazi definitely shined, and thus he is definitely restriction. And in fact, speaking of Onazi, let's talk about him next. First, I think it is obvious as well, Onazi is definitely a genius. He does not analyze nor adapt, he just does what he does, and so he is a genius. Then for being restriction or freedom, I feel like it's the same for Obo. The only difference in my mind is that Onazi is more on the extreme side of restriction than Obo, and so I am going to place both in tier 3 and both are restriction, with Onazi being more restriction than Obo. However, next we have the ninja Otoya Eita. Now this is another case where it is pretty obvious when it comes to figuring out whether Otoya is a genius or a talented learner, because simply put, he is definitely a genius. There is no thought process behind his playing style, as he just knows how to sneak up behind players because his family is a true ninja family. However, where would we put him in terms of tiers? I feel like due to his playing style specifically, I am going to put him in tier 3. He is not as extreme as Bachira or Shido, and at the same time he is not that close to talented learners, and so tier 3 seems to be fitting. However, enough about this, let's get to the more interesting stuff. Where does Otoya fall in terms of being restriction versus freedom? Well, I feel like it is a little bit tricky with Otoya, because at first I thought he is restriction because he follows in Karasu and Bachira's footsteps. However, that's actually not the case. Otoya actually never followed Karasu, nor did he follow Bachira. He only did what he could so he can shine and score. And in fact, we've seen him when Karasu completely changed gears and gave the ball to Chigiri in the third selection. Otoya found no issue switching and meeting Chigiri in the most optimal spot, meaning he is very malleable and he is a freedom type for sure. But I wouldn't say he is as freedom type as Bachira, of course, and so he is in the middle. But next we have the most dominant and the most threatening player in all of Blue Lock. Of course, I'm talking about none other than Chris Prince. Now, truth be told, Prince is actually one of the trickiest players for a list like this. One look at him and you would swear he is a genius. However, a deeper look into him would reveal he is definitely a talented learner. The fact that he cares about showing off more than anything should tell you everything about his personality. He is a holistic or a world type player, meaning he is without a doubt a talented learner. However, even how he became to be the second player in the world. Prince looked at football, he analyzed it and then adapted to it, meaning he is definitely a talented learner. However, one cannot deny the fact that Prince has a lot of latent talent that he actually relies on often, and so for that reason I would be putting him in tier 3 with the likes of Kaiser and Aiku. As where he stands in terms of restriction versus freedom, I already alluded to this with Nagi. Prince is definitely freedom type. He is not as extreme, but he is definitely freedom type, so he is somewhere in there. However, next we have everyone's favorite hothead, Raichi Jingo. Now, to be honest, I don't really know where to place Raichi. He seems like a genius for sure, but he also learns a lot, and so I don't know, and honestly I don't care that much. I will put him as a genius, but he is in tier 4, very close to talented learners. As for freedom versus restriction, I feel like it's obvious Raichi is definitely restriction, not the extreme form of restriction or even in the middle. I feel like he is close to being neutral, and that's because he excels in restriction that he employs, and not necessarily restriction put on him. And until we see that, I can't place him any closer to the extreme form of restriction. Moving on, however, we have Reo Mikage, which is actually one of the more interesting characters in the show. You see, Reo having metavision and wanting to win the World Cups makes him without a doubt a talented learner. However, one cannot deny his own talent. His chameleon style is not something that any player can dish out. Even Rin found it hard to copy Sae, while we've seen Reo do it almost flawlessly. And so I think he is the same as Hiori and Hiraji, being very close to the genius side while definitely being talented learners, and so he is on the closest tier to the geniuses. As for where he stands in terms of freedom or restriction, I mean, it is pretty obvious. I spoke of it earlier, he is definitely freedom type. And in fact, the argument for this is very interesting. You see, because of how infinite his chameleon style, I am very sure that Reo is definitely freedom type. However, I would not put him on the same level as Isagi or Hiori, and so he is in tier 2. But moving on, we have the destroyer of the universe, Rin Itoshi. Now, Rin, despite him being one of the most interesting characters in the show, is pretty obvious for today's video because Isagi explained everything. Rin is for sure restriction, and Rin is for sure a genius. However, you gotta keep this in mind. This was not actually the case for the longest time we've seen Rin. At first, and because he was copying Sae, he definitely acted like talented learners. And at the same time, he acted as complete freedom. However, when he was pushed and his true ego showed up, we've learned that Rin is a genius that was able to pull off metavision when he really tried to. And of course, in terms of restriction, as you all know, the main trigger to his berserker state is definitely him being pushed. And so for that reason, Rin is an obvious one. However, I gotta say this, I'm not going to place him as an extreme genius, simply because he was copying Sae too much. Maybe he is right now a pure genius, but the fact that he is thinking about Sae that much and he is trying to copy him hinders him from reaching the extreme of being a genius. But the same could not be said about his restriction. No one actually excels and lives for restriction the same as Rin. And so for that reason, much like Kaiser, he is on the lowest form of restriction. He is without a doubt the most extreme form of restriction. But after Rin, you know who comes. His brother Sae Itoshi. Now it is pretty obvious in the community that Sae is definitely a talented learner, not only because of metavision, but we've seen him times and times again analyze the field before adapting and delivering his signature passes. However, I feel like much like Kaiser, he has a lot of talent and he is very good at utilizing it, and so he is in tier 3. As for being freedom versus restriction, I mean it is pretty obvious he is freedom type. The guy was literally elevating the strikers of the U20 team with his own freedom. He was feeding them perfect pass after another, and so that's where I am going to place him. But next we have the shittiest player on the list, Sendo Shuto, who I actually do not care about, much like Fukaku and Onazi, and I am going to place him in the middle, with him leaning towards being restriction, because even though Sae gave him the ultimate freedom, he still did not pull off anything, and so for that sole reason he is definitely restriction. But moving on to a more interesting striker, we have Shido Ryuse. Now I feel like the main characters are pretty obvious, and Shido is much like Bachira, the extreme form of being a genius while being the extreme form of freedom. There is literally no doubt in my mind, and Shido is one of the easiest to identify. And so let's actually move on, because next we have a pro, which is the Brazilian tank Dada Silva. Now obviously much like Blake, little is known about Silva. However, from the little clips we've seen him play, he is definitely a genius. As for being restriction versus freedom, I honestly do not know. I am going to take a wild guess and say that he is freedom, but I am not confident in this at all. And so let's just move on to a more interesting pro, which is none other than the best in the world, Mark Snuffy. Now obviously Snuffy is definitely a talented learner, that's just a given. However, where does he stand in terms of tiers? Now I honestly think he is the ultimate form of being a talented learner. In terms of restriction versus freedom, things get a little bit dicey here. You see, on one hand, he seems to restrict his team a lot. However, one cannot deny that his plans are definitely near infinite. And if they are near infinite, meaning that Snuffy is definitely a freedom type. In fact, the only way Isagi was able to do anything against this monster was when he restricted his freedom with Raichi. And for that reason, I think it is obvious that Snuffy is definitely freedom type. I would say he is on the extreme side of freedom type, but I am not really that sure. As I said, his tactics, even though they are freedom type, they also feel restrictive to his players, and so I am going to take it safe and not place him on the extreme. But that's all for Snuffy, and let's move on to another player, which is none other than Yukimiya Kenyu. Now I feel like Yuki is kinda the same like Lorenzo. He is a genius because he is great at dribbling, however even his dribbling is definitely restrictive. But I would not say he is as big of a genius as Lorenzo. We've seen him with a lot of traits from talented learners, especially after losing to Isagi, and so I am going to place him in tier 3. As for being restriction versus freedom, I mean come on. He has street style dribbling, which means he excels in a lot of obstacles and a lot of players that he needs to get past. Meaning the more restriction you put on him, the more his dribbling becomes better. And so he is definitely restriction. However, I would not say he is anywhere near being on the extreme form of restriction, simply because the way he improves his dribbling is not that extreme as someone like, for example, Rin or Kaiser. And so for that reason, that's where I am going to place Yuki. But finally, we reach the final player on our list, which is none other than Zantetsu. I mean, what can I tell you about him? He is a genius, of course, because he relies on nothing but his speed, and because he is a complete idiot, which is kinda ironic. I am calling him a genius and at the same time an idiot, but that's all due to the fact that the term genius means something different in Blue Lock. In any case, however, as I said, Zantetsu is definitely a genius. I wouldn't say he is the most extreme genius, but I feel like he is right next to Chigiri. As for restriction versus freedom, I mean he is a speedster much like Loki and Chigiri, and so he is definitely a freedom type. The worst thing you could do to a speedster is put restriction on his course, and so for that reason, the last player on our list is definitely a genius who is freedom type. However, that's all I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and please let me know what do you think about this. Do you agree? Do you disagree with me? But until next time, thank you for watching.